I'm Dave Spencer, Diné and Mississippi Chutta, Executive Director of the Chicago American Indian Center and co-curator of Indigenous Chicago.
And I'm Doug Keel, citizen of the Oneida Nation, Associate Professor of History at Northwestern University, and co-curator of Indigenous Chicago.
Chicago is and has always been an indigenous place. As homelands of the Anishinaabe, Potawatomi, Odawa, Ojibwe, Illinois Confederation, Peoria, Kaskaskia, and others, Myaamia, Wea, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Mascoutin, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee peoples, this area has been the crossroads for indigenous nations for thousands of years. It continues to be home to a diverse and flourishing urban Native community. This exhibition examines more than 5 centuries of history on the land now known as Chicago by centering on indigenous voices, exploring the impacts of European colonialism, and envisioning indigenous futures.
When Europeans arrived in North America, they entered an already established native world. This map, based on the writings of French missionaries and explorers from the late 17th century, promoted the development of a French colony in the Mississippi River Valley. Chicago is noted as an established, inhabited place, and the surrounding names locate several indigenous nations.
The forced removal of Native peoples from their lands in what is now the state of Illinois was motivated by a desire to control and transform the environment in support of white settlement. This speech made by Myaamia leader Mishkinakwa, or Little Turtle, at the 1795 Treaty of Greenville negotiations was the first of 4 treaties that ceded land in Chicago. For indigenous people who had long-standing practices for recognizing territorial boundaries that predate colonization, treaties were seen as agreements that had the potential to create respectful and mutually beneficial relationships. But settlers did not recognize indigenous legal systems as valid. They saw treaties as transactional and used a variety of predatory strategies to secure land and forcibly remove Native people.
In most narratives of Chicago history, Native people disappear after forced removal in the 1830s. But the reality is much different. This case shows a few examples of the many Native people who lived in and traveled to Chicago well after the removal period. From the Chicago Tribune. One from 1872, announcing the death of Potawatomi Treaty Representative Alexander Robinson, or Chichimpinque. And another from 1875, narrating the visit of Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiian, King David Lamea Kalakaua. We also have a 20th century photograph of the Ojibwe Hardy family and the autographed point shoes of Osage ballerina Maria Tallchief, who founded the Chicago City Ballet in 1981 with her sister Marjorie.
These items encourage us to consider the variety of reasons that led people to return or relocate to Chicago after the removal period.
Thousands of Native people moved to the Chicago area in the mid-20th century as part of this relocation program, but the city's intertribal community worked against the assimilation-focused efforts of the initiative. This propaganda poster from the Bureau of Indian Affairs shows the Red Lake Ojibwe Burns family in their new home in Waukegan. Posters like these were circulated in an effort to convince Native families to move to cities like Chicago and the surrounding suburbs. Propaganda materials promised well-paying jobs, housing, and support for Native families who chose to move. Those who relocated were often met with harsh racism, discrimination, and dire housing conditions.
In response to the lack of support they encountered, Native people founded grassroots organizations like the Native American Committee and the Chicago Indian Village to advocate for issues like affordable housing and educational and employment opportunities for indigenous people living in Chicago. The Chicago Indian Village led several actions and protests, including the protest shown in this photo of Carol Warrington and her 6 children after they were evicted from their home. Chicago Indian Village's organizing led to promised units of housing for the Native community by the Chicago Housing Authority, and the Native American Committee contributed to several Native-run schools in the city.
Here you can see a portrait of Oneida community leader Louis Delgado, who led Owayawa Elementary School, and 4 images of staff and students at Native American Educational Services College.
You can also see 2 issues of the Native American Committee's publication, Red Letter, which further reflect this investment in the broader community. This issue includes a section about the Native American community's history as well as information about a community meeting regarding the Indian Child Welfare Act and a local conference held here at the Newberry.
From the moment settlers arrived in this region in the late 17th century, they disrupted not only centuries-old Native communities and intertribal relationships, but the very landscape upon which these connections have been forged. These changes are drastic and have been destructive, but it's important to emphasize that today, Native people are renewing relationships with this land and reclaiming traditional lifeways. Some do this through art. Here you can see 3 teaching blankets created by Potawatomi artist Jason Wesaw that speak to the ongoing connections that Indigenous people hold to the land and waterways in Chicago.
Today, Chicago is home to a diverse and flourishing Native community made up of people from more than 100 different Indigenous nations across the United States and Canada. Those of us who are part of this community have unique identities as urban Native people. We maintain connections to our distinct tribal nations, but also consider Chicago and the Native community here our home.